According to her bio, Helen Simonson began her writing career, quote, desperate for some intellectual escape from the diapers and the baby gym classes, end quote, while raising her children. The resulting first novel, Major Pettigrew's Last Stand, took the publishing world by storm, introducing readers to the unlikely love story of a retired British Army officer and Mrs. Ali, the elegant woman who works at the local convenience store. That book went on to be a New York Times bestseller and sold in 21 countries. Her new book, The Summer Before the War, is set in Rye, an ancient port town in the south of England, which coincidentally is Ms. Simonson's own hometown. There we're introduced to the community of artists, writers, eminent townspeople, servants, and workers, including Beatrice Nash, a young woman recently arrived in town to be the Latin master at the local school. The lightness and frivolity of summer gives way, though, as war looms on the continent, certain to drastically alter all of their lives. We meet the indomitable Aunt Agatha and her nephews, Hugh, a medical student who will find himself assigned to a field hospital, and Daniel, a poet who volunteers as a soldier, as well as other luminary and some not quite so luminary citizens. The Summer Before the War immerses readers in a time and place on the edge of cataclysm. It's a story of love and betrayal, honor and petty prejudice, and a community that rises to the obligations of country. It's a magnificent novel, and we're proud to host Helen Simonson at Politics and Prose.
Well, that was such a great introduction. Can I have that to take with me to give to other people? So, thank you. I didn't need 4 reserved chairs, so if there's 2 chairs if anyone wants to move and sit down, ladies in the back. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be back in DC. When Major Pettigrew came out, my family was living here in Bethesda. It was a wonderful 2 years, but we're not suburban people. We had been here about 24 hours when we realized that there was no deli on the corner to get bagels. But I feel very warm about DC. It was a wonderful market from which to launch a book. The DC press was very kind, and I made lots of writing friends here, which you don't always do in New York, which is a little more competitive. Anyway, this evening I thought I would talk a little bit about my book, and then maybe a little bit about the writing process and how it might differ writing a second novel than writing a debut novel. So instead of telling you about my book, I thought that perhaps I would read you a fabulous review from the Seattle Times. So as not to appear to be bragging. But then I thought, instead of reading this fabulous review from the Seattle Times, that what was more interesting is, due to the magic of the internet, the Seattle Times review was picked up as far away as China. And then and I don't speak Mandarin, I assure you, and then because of the magic of the internet, there are apparently US news sites that troll China looking for items of interest to American readers. So this is a fabulous review of my book that's been through double translation. A lady of substance in the summertime earlier than the warfare. Helen Simonson's new novel, The Summertime Earlier Than the War, is ideal for readers in a published Downton Abbey stoop. Because it chronicles the fortunes of a younger lady in a seaside English city proper earlier than World Struggle I. At 23, Beatrice is an orphan with neither husband nor fortune, and is seen with some pity as a spinster, appropriate sufficient to earn a meagre dwelling, tutoring and educating unruly boys. The Summertime Earlier Than the Warfare, Helen Simonson's comply with as much as her greatest vendor, Maine Pettigrew's Final Stand, follows a well-known Austen Bronte Eliot arc. Well, I'm glad they got that bit. Austen Bronte Eliot, I'll take it. Like a whole season of Downton Abbey, packed right into a single spacious quantity that is one other vicarious submersion, right into a tradition the place higher crust women vie for social energy. But in addition, like that TV collection, the e-book applies trendy consciousness. Because the working class struggles alongside, these it serves are sometimes extra nervous by what individuals will assume than what compassion dictates. The longer-term prospects of a shiny boy from a poor household are dim. When push involves shove, Agatha, for all her generosity of spirit, caves in. Simonson spent her adolescence in Rye, and she, or he, superbly describes the pleasure of such a bucolic setting. Unlimited digital access, $1 for 4 weeks. I shall hurry to subscribe. Anyway, to give you a little more information, perhaps if you didn't get all of that, this book is a love story of late Edwardian summer. It is set in my hometown of Rye. I spent my teenage years there, and it's a very ancient and beautiful town on a hill by the seaside. It's also a very literary town. When I was a teenager, I had a Saturday job, and I spent all my Saturday job money in the local bookshop, and they had a special bookcase for local authors. The local authors in Rye are Henry James, Radcliffe Hall, E.F. Benson, Rudyard Kipling and Virginia Woolf, who were just down the way in West Sussex. So these were the kind of, local authors that I grew up reading. And so I wanted to set my novel there, and I think I wanted to set it in Edwardian times. I think we all think we could be Edwardians. It's an era of fabulous hats and garden parties. But it's also an era of tremendous progress. The motor car, electric light, the telephone, the flying machine, indoor plumbing, if you were wealthy enough. And of course, we all assume we would have been wealthy enough. But of course, the summer that I chose is 1914. So of course, my characters, we know, the readers know, they're in jeopardy. And this was inspired by Henry James. In 1914, he stood on the ramparts of my hometown, and he gazed across the channel on a beautiful summer day, and he remembered the American Civil War. He had been a young man at the time, and he had this tremendous premonition of the horrors that were to come, when all around him everybody was just enjoying their bucolic setting. And he wrote an essay about it, and this struck me very much. He also wrote about Belgian refugees. He was very involved in Belgian refugee work, and this was a story that was omitted from the history books when I was growing up. I had no idea that the UK took in 250,000 Belgians and housed and fed and looked after them for 4 years, all through private charitable subscription in every town and city in the UK. It was amazing. Towards the end, I have to say, some of the things you hear today about immigrants and refugees came to the fore. People wondered why they were being housed for free when British workers were perhaps homeless, and maybe they were taking our jobs. And so you may or may not know this, but in order to improve the impression people had of Belgian refugees, a little-known author named Agatha Christie invented Hercule Poirot. He was supposed to set everything straight. Anyway, so that's where my novel's set. Yes, a Latin teacher comes to town. She upsets the social apple cart. She meets Agatha Kent, this progressive matriarch, and she meets Agatha Kent's nephews, a rising young surgeon, and a very beautiful young poet named Daniel. And so while the book is about them really starting their adult lives and their dreams and ambitions and their difficulties, because obviously as a woman, a spinster and penniless, Beatrice has some difficulties, it being 1914. That's how the book starts, but then of course when war breaks out, everybody will be forced to reevaluate, and my book becomes about what you think is important to build in your lives and what remains when everything's falling apart, and more specifically, what is destroyed by war and what is burnished in the fire. So the difference between writing my first novel and this, my second novel, the success of Major Pettigrew was a complete shock to me and to all of my family. I had been writing for some 10 or 15 years, as it was said in the introduction, escaping from the babies and going once a week to writing class. But I think my family viewed that as, well, that's what, middle-aged ladies do, right? It's writing class Wednesdays, book club Thursdays, and then maybe Pilates on the weekend. But we're not expected to amount to anything. In fact, the success of Pettigrew was so unexpected that my boys didn't even notice. Not until a couple months later, when a movie director, one who directs the kind of movies they like, the big action superhero movies, called me during dinner about optioning it for a movie. And I came down, and I was very proud, and I told them what had happened. And my older son, Ian, looked at my younger son and said, "Hey, Jamie, Mom wrote a book." And even my father, who is my greatest fan and who thinks that that Hemingway chap has nothing on his daughter, even he pulled me aside at an event in England to ask me very anxiously, "So do you think you can do it again?" I thought so. I thought, being a mature woman and with the validation of publication, that the blank page could hold no terrors for me. But boy, was I in for a big surprise when I sat down. And the only difference between writing a debut novel and a second novel was, second time around, I was not in workshop, I was not in an MFA program, and everybody else in the world now assumed I knew what I was doing. So was there pressure with this book coming out a couple of weeks ago? No, I was at a family wedding last summer, and a very nice male relative of mine patted me on the shoulder and reminded me that I should feel no pressure about my second book, because he said, everyone knows second books tank. So this is what a writer has to put up with. So, I mean, this was my fear all along. The fear is that you will be a one-hit wonder. And I would like to have a list of, pop music one-hit wonders to tell you, but maybe we can talk about that later. But yes, you fear that lightning won't strike twice. And so how to go forward? The only way I knew how to go forward was to create for myself more challenges. I don't write what I know. I write to ask questions and explore themes and hope to find some answers for myself. So this time, the first bigger challenge was this book is big enough to warrant 3 narrative voices instead of that one singular Major Pettigrew voice. So I'm in the heads of Agatha Kent, the matriarch. I'm in the heads of Beatrice Nash, the young Latin teacher. And I'm in the head of the rising young surgeon, Hugh Grange, who is Agatha's nephew. The second challenge was to raise the stakes. Hiding under all the jollity of Major Pettigrew, there were some, I hope, serious issues, but this is war. It's perhaps the ultimate issue, so the stakes were higher. And finally, of course, I forgot when deciding to do this book that it was in fact being set in 1914, and so I quickly discovered that that requires historical research. And yes, that was alarming. I don't know how Hilary Mantel does it, and I can tell you for sure my next book will not have a historical setting. It's a lot of work. It's really fun. Because I now was published and I had a business card and everything. I was able to go to the New York Library, the one with the lions, and make an appointment with a senior research librarian. And the research librarians pulled bibliographies for me, they produced materials, they suggested avenues, and I got to pick a desk and put all my research materials around me and have my little glasses and sit around looking and hoping everybody thought I looked like a PhD student. But I'm really a lousy and distracted researcher. It's a lot of fun, but I spend a lot of time going down all kinds of side roads and blind alleys. There's a character in my book, a minor character, whose father is a Romany, a gypsy. And so I obviously had to research gypsies in Britain in 1914. And it was so interesting that I also researched the full history of gypsies in Britain up to the present day. And then I also went back from around the year 1100 and looked at the international plight of the ethnic Roma, a minority, or an ethnic minority, about whom people of otherwise good character have no problem coming up with the kind of horrible stereotypes we would never use about any other group. So I even made a friend, a professor who's a United Nations and international expert on Romany studies. And then about 3 or 4 months later, I had a stack of notes this high, and I realized I wasn't actually writing a novel about the international plight of the Roma. So I had to put that aside. My favorite research experience, though, had to be going to the British Library's periodicals section. It's in a gritty North London suburb, and there they allow you to read original newspapers and magazines from 1914 and 15. They bring them to you bound in huge leather volumes. They give you a big oak slanted desk under a sunny window. And at lunchtime, they watch your laptop and send you to the Pakistani cafe across the way for egg and chips. So, very civilized. But I got to read ladies' magazines, which I love. I love women's magazines, my secret vice. And I got to read The Lady and Gentlewoman and Country Life, as my matriarch Agatha Kent would have read them, coming into her house on a weekly basis. And the war was not telegraphed on the front page like in the newspaper, but it began to creep in. There was a recipe for economical Christmas pudding. And the advice columns, how to talk to the staff about how the food shortages meant there would no longer be a meat course at supper. And finally, even in the social columns, the weddings and engagements began to be replaced very slowly with the words "was to have been married," as the flower of England's young aristocracy began to fall in the trenches alongside their men. Research is also wildly seductive because you feel like you're really working, where I can tell you, and I know there are some other writers here, perhaps they can corroborate, writing fiction doesn't always feel like a real job, but research does. But eventually you have to put the research aside. You have to put it aside and you have to write the story. And then, when the story is done, all through editing, what I found myself doing this second time around is spending my time paring away the historic detail down to the bare bones, because nothing suffocates a historical novel than to have the author showing off how much she has learned and wants you to know she knows. And so all the way into copy editing, I was having to take out these wonderful nuggets of information. For example, I know everything about the water company and sewage system in Rye in 1914. I'd be happy to take questions on the most engineering details of the whole thing. And, you know, there's one or two mahogany thrones in my book, but for the most part, the bathrooms had to come out. So the process is different this time. I wrote alone. And so this time, when I gave the book to my editor, it hadn't been to workshops or an MFA thesis committee. She got the whole soggy mess at once. I sort of describe it as a bowl of spaghetti and meatballs without the bowl. And I want to talk about the editing, because another funny thing happens when you finish a book. A steel curtain comes down, and on the one hand, you can't remember having written the book. You think it's quite brilliant, but you can't remember having written it. And on the other hand, you can't remember that anybody helped you. So, to paraphrase President Obama, I didn't build that. I had help. And so I thought, in order to keep myself honest and to let you know how valuable a good editor is, that I might read to you from one of the 2,759 emails that my editor sent me. This is really about a tiny chapter in which the ladies of Rye gather for their Belgian Relief Committee meeting. My editor says, "The introduction of the tall teak-backed chair meant to render Bettina Fothergill, the mayor's wife, distracted and fidgety, never seems to have an effect on Bettina. In fact, Bettina seems quite focused during the meeting. Does one spritz draperies in the early 1900s? Just asking." "Suggest you cut the severe Alice Finch. Reader has gotten that she is severe already. Perhaps amp up the negativity towards Bettina. I am unclear what the reader is meant to take away at the end of this chapter. Why does Beatrice's face relax? I'm still a bit confused. It's a bit murky." And then, because, you know, the writer, we live for the poetry of the individual sentence. I wrote, "Her long face seemed to stretch further than usual, and her chin trembled." And my editor wrote, "You can do better." And I wrote, "Compassion, as usual, fluttering its feeble wings and dying against her stiffly corseted bosom." And my editor wrote, "Slippery author voice and a bit overcooked." And finally she closes by saying, "Helen, tremulous may be overused." So just in case you thought that nothing needed editing. And to put the cherry on the top of this story, So I read this first at my launch reading in Brooklyn. My editor was there, and I'm feeling very smug, like I'm paying homage to this woman who sends me checks. Isn't this a great idea? And meanwhile, as I'm saying this, she leans over to my husband, John, who was there, and says, not that her first book didn't need a hell of a lot of editing, too. And so I know you're all eager to get to questions, so if you can hold off raising your hands for one moment, I thought I would read you a couple of pages from the front of the book, just so that perhaps you could hear some of it in my own voice. The town of Rye rose from the flat marshes like an island, its tumbled pyramid of red-tiled roofs glowing in the slanting evening light. The high Sussex bluffs were a massive, unbroken line of shadow from east to west. The fields breathed out the heat of the day, and the sea was a sheet of hammered pewter. Standing at the tall French windows, Hugh Grange held his breath, in a vain attempt to suspend the moment in time, as he used to do when he was a little boy in this same slightly shabby drawing-room, and the lighting of the lamps had been the signal for his aunt to send him to bed. He smiled now to think of how long and late those summer evenings had run, and how he had always complained bitterly until he was allowed to stay up well beyond bedtime. Small boys, he now knew, were inveterate fraudsters, and begged, pleaded, and cajoled for added rights and treats with innocent eyes and black hearts. The 3 boys his aunt had asked him to tutor this summer had relieved him of half a sovereign and most of his books before he realized that they were neither as hungry as their size proposed, nor had any interest in Ivanhoe, except for what it might bring when flogged to the man with a second-hand bookstall in the town market. He held no grudge. Instead, he admired their ferret wits, and held some small dream that his brief teaching and example might turn sharpness into some intellectual curiosity by the time the grammar school began again. The door to the drawing-room was opened with a robust hand, and Hugh's cousin Daniel stood back with a mock bow to allow their Aunt Agatha to pass into the room. Aunt Agatha says there isn't going to be a war, said Daniel, coming in behind her, laughing, and so of course there won't be. They would never dream of defying her. Aunt Agatha tried to look severe, but only managed to cross her eyes and almost stumbled into a side table due to the sudden blurring of her vision. That isn't what I said at all, she said, trying to secure her long embroidered scarf, an effort as futile as resting a flat kite on a round boulder, thought Hugh, as the scarf immediately began to slide sideways again. Aunt Agatha was still a handsome woman at 45, but she was inclined to stoutness and had very few sharp planes on which to drape her clothing. Tonight's dinner dress in slippery chiffon possessed a deep sloppy neckline and long oriental sleeves. Hugh hoped it would maintain its dignity through dinner. What does Uncle John say? Asked Hugh, stepping to a tray of decanters to pour his aunt her usual glass of Madeira. No chance he's coming down tomorrow? Your uncle says they're all working feverishly to smooth things over before everyone's summer holiday, says his aunt. He tells me nothing, of course, but the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary spent much of the day closeted with the King. Uncle John was a senior official in the Foreign Office, and the usually sleepy summer precincts of Whitehall had been crammed with busy civil servants, politicians and generals since the Archduke's assassination in Sarajevo. Anyway, he telephoned to say he met the school teacher and transferred her to Charing Cross to catch the last train, so she'll be getting in after dinner. We'll give her a late supper. At such a late hour, wouldn't it be kinder to deliver her to her rooms in town and maybe have cook send down something cold, said Daniel, ignoring Hugh's proffered dry sherry and pouring a glass of Uncle John's best whiskey. I'm sure she'll be horribly fagged and not up to a room full of people in dinner dress. He tried to keep a neutral face, but Hugh detected a slight moue of distaste at the thought of entertaining the new schoolteacher his aunt had found. Since graduating from Balliol in June, Daniel had spent the first few weeks of summer in Italy as the guest of an aristocratic college chum, and had developed a sense of social superiority that Hugh was dying to see Aunt Agatha knock out of his silly head. Instead, Agatha had been patient, saying, "Oh, let him have his taste of the high life. Don't you think his heart will be broken soon enough? When Daniel goes into the Foreign Office this autumn, as your Uncle John has taken such pains to arrange, I'm sure his friend will drop him in an instant. Let him have his hour of glamour." Thank you. Hands are going up. Is that a hand raised whilst a question? Thank you. You have the speediest audience.
Please step to a microphone if you'd like to ask a question.
Ooh, 2 microphones. You have no idea in Canada, they're so polite, nobody raises a hand because they don't want to be first. And so I'm halfway to the parking lot and have to be dragged back. So.
My question deals with the transition from your book to an audio book. I often enjoy having both the written copy and the audible edition. You had 2 different narrators, one for Major Pettigrew and one for that. How involved do you become in that? Do you have any say as to who the narrator is? And are you on scene in the studio to help him or her phrase it and deliver it? Anyway, that's it.
Thank you. Well, that's the difference between first-time author and second-time author. First-time author, no involvement whatsoever. It's like, we paid you, please go away. Second time around, I was actually sent examples of multiple different narrators and asked to choose. And that was very important for me. We had to choose whether it would be a man or a woman, because there's 3 narrative voices, 2 of which are women. So we did go with a woman. And especially in America, some people who do British voices, it can become very, what I call Paddington Bear-like. Very, very, very cozy. And since this audiobook runs something of like 23 hours, I didn't think anyone, certainly I could not go with 23 hours of cozy. I would shoot myself. So we got a very strong voice, but definitely an Aunt Agatha. I think her name is Fiona Hartington. Anyway, if you care to go with the audiobook, I believe it's 16 CDs. Who knew I wrote War and Peace? I can't imagine. Oh, I'm just grateful that I'm not reading it, because I also couldn't listen to myself reading for that amount of time. No, I'm not there, which is probably good, because I've actually lived in the United States for 30 years, so I am no longer an authority on the proper British accent, and in fact, my mother refers to me as a dreadful Yank. So. Yes? Can you make your way to the microphone? Feel free to queue up.
So, do you have the plot at the beginning of the whole thing and work to a definitive ending, or do you feel that the characters drive you?
Yes, perhaps having some kind of plot outline would take me less than 5 years to write a book. But no, what I do is a character will walk into my head. Aunt Agatha walked into my head. In fact, it was a funny story. My first novel was accepted by an agent. She invited me to come to see her. I sat in her office and squirmed around on a very plastic modern chair and sort of peered at her if she was speaking Chinese, because she's telling me that she loves it, she wants to represent me, and I'm going to be a published author. And I was so overwhelmed that I actually couldn't find my way out of her office, and I was going around the reception area like this looking for the door, and finally I was sort of disgorged onto a busy New York street into the middle of traffic. And it seemed as if the whole landscape of rhyme, perhaps it was all those writers from my teenage years, in some very humble way, I was going to be one of them. The whole landscape rose up before me, and I seemed to be standing with this woman on the hilltop, and it was Agatha Kent. So what I do is I just latch on to these characters immediately, and I follow them around, which is a very meandering, organic, not very efficient way of writing a book, perhaps. But for me, it's a joy. It's sort of watching the movie unfurl in my own head. I didn't even know if we were going to war, or how we were going to war, or who was going to war when I began the book. And I very much tried to hold back from making any guesses and let my characters, get on a train when they're ready to get on a train. So as I say, not the most efficient way, but that's my process. So thank you. Yes.
I have recorded over 100 books, and I can tell you I would hate to have the author there when I was recording. The other question I wanted to ask you was the golf course, I've been in Rye recently, was the golf course there in 1914?
Yes, it was. The Rye Golf Club which is very funny. It's this very scruffy-looking golf club on the dunes, and there's a special name for that kind of golf course, but I can't remember if it's links or not links. But it's very rough and dune-like, and it's one of the oldest golf clubs in England. And so the golf club appears fictionalized in Major Pettigrew, and there's the golf club. I think is in this novel too, but yes, it was definitely there. And by the way, had you been around, you would have been perfect to narrate the audiobook.
So it sounded like you had a lot of comment on your first book, a lot of people checking in with you.
Yes.
How about the second?
No, except for my husband John, who's here tonight. He's always the
job.
first reader of my pages, and I say, "Here they are. What do you think?" And then I glare at him, and he has to consider what's for dinner next week. And so he thinks I'm amazing, don't you? But no, he's actually a really good editor, so he'd seen some of it. But this time around, nobody saw any of it until the first draft.
Did you
was done.
prefer one process to the other, or?
I'm planning on writing my third book, in the same way, completely alone. I would like to write the first draft faster because actually the editing process was so much fun. I actually felt like a real writer, that I'm anxious to get to that this time. And I think I have tremendous self-doubt facing the blank page, but this time I'm going to really try to push out that first draft faster because I know the real work comes in working with the people I trust to shape it, and my agent and my editor have 142% of my trust. They're amazing, they're very smart, they've never let me astray, and so I'm looking forward to working with them again. I could tell you a quick funny story about editing my first novel because yes, I did need help. And there's a big giant golf club dance scene in Major Pettigrew, and originally it ended with an elephant stampeding through the room. Nothing clears a room like a stampeding elephant. And my editor made the mistake of saying she thought I should reconsider. She never tells me to cut anything. She just asked me what I think and what I meant and how I feel. So how did I feel about the elephant? And did I think perhaps, since I'm such a subtle writer, was how she put it, that perhaps it was a little too Monty Python? And I took this as the greatest compliment ever, because that's exactly what I was going for. And so she would question the elephant. She would ask how I felt about it. I would say that over several drafts, the elephant got smaller. By the end, he was a baby elephant, but I was insisting on keeping him. And then finally, I realized that I had such terror of this huge giant scene with so many people that indeed the elephant was some scaffolding I had put around it. I know I could get out of the scene at any point by having the elephant clear the room. So I did take it out. And I had a lovely email, one of these emails from my editor that said, "I'm so glad you decided to take the elephant out." She said, "Because taking out the elephant threw the exploding chickens into such high relief." Yes, sir.
I'm curious, as you're developing your stories and the moral themes or the kind of the deeper messages are coming out, do you have any concerns about coming across as polemical or kind of being an editorializer as opposed to a storyteller?
Absolutely. Nothing kills a story like an author pounding their political themes. I try very hard just to follow my characters around and tell their stories, and themes emerge. It's almost like magic because I'm not necessarily consciously doing it. And it was very funny with Major Pettigrew. I went to a reading early on in Bethesda at my son's high school, and somebody got up and said, "Oh, I just love your extended theme of grief in the book." And I was thinking, oh yes, I meant that. But in fact, I had no idea I had written extensively about grief. And when I went back, of course, it was there. So I'm not sure if that's true for all writers, but I suspect that a lot of time, we're busy writing a story and we're desperately hoping that really important themes will emerge. But I would say it will really make your life difficult as a writer if you start by saying, I want to convey this or that. Yes.
Hi there. I read the book as an early reader. I loved it.
Thank you.
But I have a question about the title, since it's not quite reflective of the book. So at what point in the process did you come up with the title, and how did you?
The title was a bit of a battle. Major Pettigrew's Last Stand was the title of the original short story I wrote, and it always stayed there, and I was always waiting for somebody to remove it. And finally, the book was in the bookstore, and it was still there. And in fact, it was accompanied by a picture of a hat stand, so it was Major Pettigrew's Last Hat Stand. But in this case, I had several other titles, and they were deemed too elegiac, too pastoral. My husband's favorite, The Hop King, sounded a little like a horror movie. And I had The Lark Ascending, which actually was a Vaughan Williams beautiful piece written in 1914, so I would have had a soundtrack. But people at Random House thought that this book had an edge to it and needed a stronger title. But then any time I threw war in the title, they would go, oh no, too strong, too strong. And so eventually we went with plain. I'm a huge fan of plain. And so, you know, it should really be the summer before the war plus a little bit of winter and a minor part of spring. But it's a little too long. Now, had I known that the summer before World Struggle I was available, you know, I would have used that. So it was a negotiation, and finally I just insisted on the summer before the war because it has war, but it has summer. So, and it's plain, right? You can't get much plainer. And yes, it's a little bit bait and switch. By the end of this novel, if you haven't read it, I will break your heart. We are going to war. I admit that. But maybe people won't know that, and they'll buy it in the summer.
It was great.
Thank you.
Buy
Thank you.
any
It was
time of
great.
year.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
You mentioned a third book. Are you ready to talk about it at all?
Well, I made the mistake of talking about it to some people, including my editor. And let me tell you, when an eyebrow goes up, that's all it takes for the writer to be reduced to a crumbling neurotic mess. Like, oh my God, it's the biggest pile of garbage in the world. And yet we're wedded to it. You know, we're wedded to what we're doing. So even though we think everybody will hate it, we're going to do it anyway. And I've also discovered that the more I speak, the less I write, which is a problem for me to begin with. My writing process is procrastination. I write as infrequently as possible, and eventually something gets extruded. So I've decided this time around to hush my mouth about my third novel and put my little bottom in the chair in front of the computer and get it done, and then I'll tell you all about it. Yes, sir.
Two questions.
Two.
The first is, from when you first sit down and perhaps sketch out the story and put together an outline and start writing, how different is it by the time you come to the very end?
That's a great question.
And my second question is the Lovely Mermaid Inn still there?
Okay, I'm going to answer the second question first. The Lovely Mermaid Inn is still there. The Mermaid Inn is one of the newer buildings in town. It has a plaque on it apologizing for the fact that it was rebuilt in 1450. So this is how old the town is. It does a wonderful, very formal English dinner, lots of beef Wellington and waiters in suits. And the ceilings are about yay high, and there are original frescoes on the wall. And if you ever get to Rye, I highly recommend it. Radcliffe Hall stayed there before she bought a house in Rye. And it's just absolutely beautiful. The whole town is like that. Even the fish and chip shop in the high street has a plate glass window, but it's a 15th century cottage. So you should do that. In terms of how different the book is, that's a great question. There is no outline for me. So it's just I'm starting, and 5 years later, I finished. And yes, I grow and change as a person. And I think the book changes. And that's a really interesting, creative conundrum for me going forward. If I write faster, will the book reflect a narrower version of me? If I write faster, will I miss out on those ideas that came to me when I woke up in year 3 and year 4 and year 5? How much, or will compressing the process just generate more ideas, and should I just stop making excuses for my lazy ass self, you know? But I think you do grow and change, and the times change, and so the themes that you're being bombarded with every day in the news and in the world change what you're doing. In my case, the book was written before refugees suddenly became this worldwide contemporary point of discussion. I was really writing something that was very historical, and now I get asked all the time about refugees, because really 250,000 refugees. They just took them in and took care of them because it was the honorable thing to do. I wish the UK and the US, would consider that again today, because it was a wonderful thing, and I think the Belgians long remembered that. It was definitely one of those high points in the British life, for which we all like to remember how good we were then. Yes.
Do you think that Rye is going to become like the Doc Martin village, and they're going to be sorry they ever heard of you?
Well, yes, and maybe then I'll get a discount at the Mermaid Hotel. That would be good. Partly I do love Rye, and so a little tiny part of me, I used to be in travel advertising. A little part of me was like, why don't I not fictionalize this time? Why don't I just, maybe more people will go visit Rye? Because it's definitely worth visiting. And in addition to the Mermaid, on a Saturday morning now, you can have coffee in Henry James's garden. And I did that with my family last summer when we were there. And actually, since I've left, the British food scene has advanced. When I left, I honestly couldn't recommend the food. You would get like a thin slice of leather masquerading as beef, and perhaps a very tough Yorkshire pudding. But the restaurant scene in Rye is amazing. Lots and lots of fresh fish pulled right out of the bay. And so very much worth it.
Well, the question I really want to ask, could you ever see yourself writing an American novel?
Yes, people ask me, why don't I write about Brooklyn Heights, which is the quintessential village full of ladies' committees on which most of them I'm on, And I say, well, I think I would have to move, because I enjoy a certain amount of distance. And I've decided that it gets rid of all the petty daily annoyances that obscure what you really love about a place and the people. So if I was in England all the time, I would have to deal with cold rain and warm beer. But as it is, I only go back about once a year, and I have my list of all the foods I must eat and all the beer and liquors I must drink, all the sherries and all the gin and tonics. And for my family, it's always a big celebration. I'll be back in May. I'm already, dinner at the Mermaid for 7, It's already in the works. And so, can I write about New York, where, I'm dealing with alternate side of the street parking, and every time the snow melts, it turns out nobody cleaned up after their dog. These things, when I sit down and want to write about the beautiful 19th century brownstones of Brooklyn, all I can think is about how nobody cleaned up after their dog. So perhaps I'll get some fellowship in Italy, and then my husband and I can move to Rome for a year, and then I'll write about Brooklyn Heights. Yes. Oh yes, Bethesda, that's a whole nother issue.
Could you come
Yes.
forward and use a microphone?
I don't think the lady can get out. You can shout.
Since Downton Abbey is set in the same period, I sort of wondered, did you find it helpful in your historic research? Because they've done massive research.
Yes, it's very funny. Downton Abbey, I put off watching it a long time because I didn't want to unconsciously or consciously borrow. And then I decided I was being foolish because nobody does costumes like the BBC, and I decided I could watch as long as the only thing I stole was all the costuming ideas. But I think only really the first season of Downton Abbey is pre-war. So I watched that right up until the heir to the estate, who'd been injured and was in a wheelchair and couldn't marry and have children. I think Lady Mary fell into his lap and he said, "Oh, I feel something stirring." And at that point, I felt like I'd gotten enough out of Downton Abbey. But I don't like to read fictional things around what I'm writing about. So I actually did not read A.S. Byatt's A Children's Book, and there was a new Alan Hollinghurst novel about a World War I poet, and that's amazing. So I have this nice stack of really good books that I'm going to get to this summer. So a lot of memoirs. I read a lot of memoirs. Agatha Christie wrote her own autobiography, and she was a young girl at this time. And I got terrific information from that. Just little things, like she happened to mention that she had to take her music with her to go to dinner at the Colonel's, because no young lady, when invited to dinner, would go without her sheet music. She would be expected to play piano after dinner. So these kind of little domestic details I was pulling out of biographies and memoirs, and then also original sources. In the UK, there's tremendous interest in World War I, and a lot of war diaries and things have been collected online. Soldiers, by the way, were not allowed to keep war diaries, but they did anyway. And this urge to write is a wonderful part of the human condition. Yes?
When can we expect the movie of Major Pettigrew?
Ah, well, John says the wheels of Hollywood grind so slowly that Daniel Radcliffe will be old enough to play the Major. But my producers are still working hard, and they are currently, I believe, in negotiations for a BBC series. So perhaps we'll go in that direction. And meanwhile, this week I made The Hollywood Reporter, who said this new book was highly optionable. So I'm waiting for film directors to call. And I have a wonderful film agent, Howie. And Howie talks like this. He's like, Howie, he's a film agent from LA. It's like, he looks like a movie version of himself. And he keeps telling me this is the greatest cover. This is the best cover. He's given it to everyone. They all agree it's the best cover in the world. By which I deduce that Howie hasn't read the book. Because, you know, that's not actually necessary in Hollywood. But no, he's terrific. So we'll see whether The Summer Before the War can get made before Major Pettigrew. But Major Pettigrew, that man has legs. Yeah. So, yes.
So a quick question about the writing process again. If you sort of approach it without an outline and you're following characters, do you find yourself rewriting a lot, or can you somehow avoid that, which I imagine would be a relief?
I think, I think it's, 20% talent and 80% perseverance, or in my case, 20% talent, 80% perseverance, and 120% panic every single day facing the computer. But I don't find myself going through too many blind alleys, and that's perhaps because I never write. So by the time I come to actually put something down, I go to bed every night worrying about my novel and wake up every day worrying about it, like a dog with a bone. And then when I do go to the computer, I think, I have the next step at least sketched out. The only things I've had to rewrite, for example, Major Pettigrew, I wrote a lovely scene in which he was accepted an invitation to tea early on in the little flat above the shop with Mrs. Ali and her nephew and her nephew's girlfriend, in which he would discover all that was going on in that family. And I wrote the entire scene, and then I had to tear it up because there was no way Major Pettigrew would have accepted such an invitation. There's no way Mrs. Ali would have given it. And so it was very hard to throw all that work away. But there weren't too many blind alleys, and I guess that's the only positive that comes out of my very slow writing process, is that I'm really, I guess, taking a step at a time. And also, I guess I do trust that process. It seems to work for me. And I guess I did know the war was coming, so I knew we were going. I sort of thought we were going to France. I just didn't know how. Anyway, thank you very, very, very much.